Hello everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It really helps YouTube show you more stories like this one. Now let's get started. I was out on Tushchamena Lake in February of 2009, working alone as I often did when ice fishing. The day had started bright and cold, the kind of cold that feels like it gnaws at your bones. By mid-afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., the wind had picked up to at least 25 miles per hour, slicing across the frozen lake. I had parked my pickup on a small rise of ice near the center of the lake and was setting up my gear, drilling a few holes here and there. The air was knife-sharp, biting anything that wasn't covered. My breath fogged and froze almost instantly on the edges of my jacket hood. I had my thermos of coffee, a small heater, and my fishing gear, thinking I'd spend the next several hours in solitude, just me, the ice, and the wind. I noticed movement far across the ice, something that at first seemed ordinary. I assumed it was another fisherman, someone else braving the harsh cold, a distant silhouette trudging toward one of the usual fishing spots. The figure was small at first, blurred by the winter haze and the sharp wind, and I figured it was nothing to worry about. But then it shifted. The way it moved didn't make sense. Even at a distance, I could see that it wasn't walking naturally. Its steps were awkward, unbalanced, and jerky, almost like it was testing each footstep before committing to it. I squinted, trying to make out more details, my coffee forgotten, my attention locked on this figure. As it drew closer, the outline became clearer. I could see its shape, tall, unnaturally tall. Way taller than any man I'd ever seen, even at a distance. Its shoulders were narrow, its arms hung longer than they should. The strangest part was its head. It twisted slowly, smoothly, and deliberately in ways that a human neck could never manage. The instant I realized it was looking directly at me, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Its eyes, or whatever I can call them that, locked with mine. I could feel it. Not in some supernatural sense, just a deep, primal, impossible awareness, like the thing knew I was there in every nerve of my body. I froze. My first instinct was to get out, to drive my pickup back to safety, but I didn't. I stayed. Part of me wanted to see if I was imagining it, or if the wind and the cold were playing tricks on me. But no, it wasn't the cold, it wasn't the wind. The figure took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward me. Not running, not walking normally, just moving. Then it stopped. It just stood there, its body frozen except for the head, which continued to twist and pivot. I could feel it staring, somehow penetrating the layers of jacket and frost and metal that separated us. I could see no sign of breath, no blink, no muscle twitch, nothing that made it human. The ice around me groaned occasionally under the weight of the wind and the temperature fluctuations, but this thing didn't seem to make a sound at all. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person with some sort of prosthetic, some kind of twisted suit. But no, the way it moved, the height, the head, it didn't make sense. Nothing fit. I stayed in my pickup for hours. My heater ran quietly, the coffee grew cold in the cup holder. I kept watching it. Every time I thought about moving, the figure would adjust, just slightly, and I couldn't make myself look away. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. The shadows grew longer as the sun sank closer to the horizon, the light fading in cold blue tones across the ice. I kept expecting it to move toward me, or vanish suddenly, but it did neither. It just stood there. Occasionally it shifted, a step to the left, a tilt of the head, almost testing me. My hands shook, not just from the cold anymore, but from some deep, unnameable fear. By the time darkness settled over Tushchamena Lake, the wind had died down slightly, but the temperature had dropped even further. I could barely see beyond the edge of my headlights. I thought maybe the thing had gone, maybe I had been hallucinating. But then I caught the movement. Slowly, it began to walk back toward the mountains. Not running, not hurried, just steady, deliberate steps. It never looked back, never paused, never broke its rhythm. The silhouette grew smaller against the dim light, disappearing into the shadowed ridges beyond the lake. I stayed until I could no longer see any trace of it, until the last glimmer of twilight had left the ice. Then cautiously, I started my pickup and drove back across the frozen expanse, eyes scanning every inch of the ice, every shadow. The road back felt endless, the sound of tires crunching the ice too loud in the silence. When I finally reached the small town on the edge of the lake, my hands still trembling, I realized I hadn't told anyone. I didn't want to. Who would believe me? A tall, unnatural figure with movements no human could manage? People would think I was exaggerating, or worse, imagining things in the isolation and cold. I didn't care. I only knew one thing for certain. Whatever that was, it was real, and I had seen it with my own eyes. Over the next few days, I avoided going back onto the lake, sticking to land and stores, places where I could see other humans. I thought about it constantly. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a hiker or hunter with a strange pack, a snowmobile rider walking across the ice, some optical illusion caused by the light and snow. But none of those explanations fit. None of them explained the height, the head, the way it moved, the way it seemed to know exactly where I was at all times. My sleep was shallow, filled with dreams of ice stretching endlessly, of dark shapes at the edge of my vision, of a figure with impossible limbs and a twisting head watching me from a distance. Weeks later, when the lake finally thawed enough for the snow to start melting, I went back cautiously, walking the perimeter rather than venturing out into the center. The ice had cracks and holes, and the wind had reshaped the snowdrifts into strange patterns, but there was no sign of footprints, tracks, or any disturbance in the ice. It was as if the thing had never existed, except for my memory. And yet, I could feel it in my mind, that impossible figure, the memory of its eyes, the way it had stared at me with such precision. It left a mark deeper than fear, something like an understanding, that the world is bigger, stranger, and less predictable than we like to admit. I never went back out on Tushchamina Lake alone again. I never saw anything like it since, and I hope I never will. But that winter, that day in February, left me with a certainty I can't explain. The world has corners we don't see, movements we can't understand, and things that walk, watch, and vanish without a trace. I carry that memory with me, a constant reminder that some things are out there, and we are lucky just to see them and survive. And that is the truth I tell anyone who asks about the lake. I saw something impossible, and I was alive to see it go. It's simple. It's clear. It's terrifying, and it's real. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The Chugach National Forest is the kind of place that feels endless, with its dense spruce and cottonwood, jagged ridges, and streams that wind through mossy floors like silver threads. I was with two friends, both experienced hikers, and our plan was simple: backpack from the Eagle River trailhead, set up a base camp somewhere along the lower ridges, and make a push to summit Eagle Peak. The weather forecast had been cautiously optimistic, clear skies for the most part, with occasional gusts of wind, but the forest is always unpredictable. I didn't fully appreciate how unpredictable until that night. We left the trailhead mid-morning, backpacks heavy but manageable, filled with food, water, and the extra layers necessary for early September in Alaska. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with the damp scent of fallen leaves and wet soil. The trail itself was a mixture of mud and pine needles, and the early part of the hike was easy. Birds called in the canopy above, and we occasionally saw the flash of movement, a squirrel or perhaps a grouse, darting through the underbrush. By early afternoon, we had broken off the trail onto a narrow side route, our boots sinking into soft moss as we climbed gradually, keeping an eye on the sky. It had grown cooler, the sunlight softer, filtering in thin streaks through the trees. By the time we reached a clearing that looked suitable for a campsite, the light had begun to fade. We picked a flat area, clear of large rocks, with a gentle slope leading down to a small creek. The smell of wet earth was stronger here, the forest quieter than I expected. Setting up the tents was straightforward, though the ground was softer than usual, almost spongy under our weight. We made a small fire in a metal ring we carried, enough for warmth and to cook our dinner. The three of us worked in silence more than conversation, each absorbed in our own thoughts. The forest around us felt immense, almost suffocating, but in a way that was peaceful. I remember thinking that this kind of isolation, surrounded by trees and the soft, darkening light, was exactly why I kept coming back to the backcountry. By the time the fire burned low, it was about 8:30 p.m. The sky was a deepening blue, and the stars were beginning to appear through the gaps in the canopy. I had just started to unzip my tent when I noticed the wind had died entirely. Normally, even in dense forest, there is some sound of leaves or branches moving, but here there was nothing. Complete silence, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small noise you normally ignore. That's when it started, the whistle. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. A faint, breathy note, like air moving through a narrow tube, came from somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I froze. The sound was steady and rhythmic, not musical, not melodic, just one clear note that seemed to hover in the air. It didn't move. There was no echo. I thought maybe one of my friends had brought a harmonica or was testing a whistle, but neither of them had any instruments. I watched the forest edge, expecting movement, expecting someone stepping into the clearing, but no one appeared. The whistle would stop briefly whenever I tried to locate it, and then start again after a moment. Curiosity got the better of me. I left the small circle of light cast by our dying fire and stepped into the shadowed underbrush. The forest felt different once I left the clearing, dense and heavy, with branches catching on my jacket and the moss squishing underfoot. I moved carefully, scanning for anything that could explain the sound. A bird? Unlikely. An animal? Maybe, but nothing I had ever heard in the Chugach made that long, controlled note. The whistle didn't rise or fall, didn't flutter like a bird's call. It was constant, unyielding, almost mechanical in its precision. I followed it slowly, ducking under low branches, stepping over fallen logs. The smell of wet soil and decaying leaves grew stronger. I had my flashlight out, sweeping its beam back and forth, catching glimpses of ferns and glistening mushrooms, the occasional moss-covered stump. I moved further into the forest than I realized, and then silence. The whistle had stopped entirely. I froze, my breath loud in my own ears. I scanned the ground and the trees, expecting to see a person, an animal, anything. That's when I noticed it, a single boot print in the damp moss, large, deep, and distinct. It wasn't mine. Not my friend's. Nothing about it matched any of us. And it wasn't fresh in the sense of having been made that night. It was just there, as though left by someone, or something, quietly stepping through the forest, moving alongside me unseen. I backed away slowly, my heart beating faster than it should have in such a quiet environment. The whistle hadn't resumed, but the forest seemed louder now. The wind had not picked up. There was still that unnerving stillness. Every snapping twig under my own boot sounded like a gunshot. I thought of turning around, heading back to camp, but every direction looked the same: dense brush, shadows, trees stretching into darkness. I took a deep breath and forced myself to remember that humans aren't invisible. Someone walking this quietly would still make some sound. I returned to the clearing, slower than when I had left, constantly checking over my shoulder. My friends noticed the tension on my face immediately. I didn't say anything at first, only shaking my head when one of them asked what I'd been doing. There was no need to tell them. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against us, the unexplainable presence lingering just beyond sight. We didn't speak much that night. The fire dwindled, the cold set in, and I lay awake, staring at the mesh ceiling of the tent, trying to convince myself it had been an animal, a trick of the wind, or my imagination. Morning came slowly. The forest had returned to its usual sounds, birdsong, the trickle of water in the creek, but the heaviness from the night remained. Over breakfast, we silently packed up our campsite, each of us careful to step lightly, almost nervous to disturb the forest again. We decided to cut the trip short. The whistle had been unnerving, yes, but it was more than that. The presence of the unseen, the boot print, the sound that could stop and start at will, it made the idea of climbing Eagle Peak feel reckless. There was no rational explanation, and that fact alone was enough to make us reconsider. The hike back to the trailhead was quiet. The forest, bathed in morning light, seemed normal. Moss clung to the rocks, streams gurgled cheerfully, and the air smelled of wet pine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following us, or had at least been aware of us, without leaving a trace except that one boot print. My mind replayed every detail of the previous night: the complete silence, the unnatural precision of the whistle, the way it seemed to respond to my attempts to find it. Nothing fit with the natural world I knew. By the time we reached the parking area, the sense of fear had subsided enough to speak again. We loaded our gear into the car without glancing back. The forest behind us looked exactly the same as it had when we entered, vast, green, indifferent, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had been to something we couldn't explain. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a creature from a story. It was something real, tangible, yet entirely outside my understanding. Something about it was calculated, patient, and observant. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement in the trees. Nothing appeared. The whistle never returned. Yet even days later, when I tried to recount the story to friends or write it down, the memory of that single note, steady and deliberate, remained vivid. And the boot print, the deep, damp print that didn't belong to anyone I knew, remained the undeniable proof that, for at least one night, we had been in the presence of something entirely unknown, something that moved through the forest without sound, without trace, and yet somehow left a mark on the world. Even now, thinking back, I still feel the pull of that forest, the way it can swallow a person whole and keep secrets better than any human ever could. The whistle was gone, but the fear stayed, not the fear of ghosts or myths, but the fear that the world contains things we cannot predict, things that are perfectly real and quietly watchful. And that is why, despite all my love for the Chugach, I have never returned to Eagle Peak. I was driving along the Denali Highway in June of 2018, late at night, the sky a deep, empty black that swallowed everything beyond the reach of my headlights. I had been on the road for hours, alone, the long stretches of nothingness pressing against the truck like the weight of the dark itself. My eyes burned from staring ahead, and my body was tense from the monotony, the rhythm of the tires on the gravel, somehow both hypnotic and exhausting. I felt a kind of creeping dread, the sort that comes from being completely alone in a vast place where no one could hear you scream. Somewhere past midnight, I decided I needed to pull over, if only to rest for a few minutes and shake off the fatigue clawing at my mind. I turned onto a small, wide shoulder of the highway, gravel crunching under the tires as I slowed to a stop. I left the engine running, the low hum a small comfort in the quiet. The only light came from my headlights, cutting through the blackness in a cone that barely reached the tree line. I leaned back in my seat, rubbing my face, trying to stay awake, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the headlights against the trees. But the shadow moved, slowly at first, and then it became unmistakable. It was a brown bear, massive, standing at the treeline. Its eyes caught the light and reflected it back in small, sharp glints. My stomach tightened. I had seen bears before, but this one wasn't like any I'd seen in a sanctuary or from a safe distance. This bear was enormous, bigger than I could comprehend, and there was a stillness about it that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then it stood upright. The sight made my chest tighten so hard I could barely breathe. Taller than my truck, the bear towered over the gravel and the trees at the edge of the road. It didn't roar, it didn't move aggressively, it just stood there, rigid, watching. The way it looked at me, I could feel it, not just see it. There was a presence there, like static, like pressure in the air that pressed against your bones and made your heart pound in a way that words can't capture. My instincts screamed to drive, to run, but I didn't. I just sat there, frozen, the truck a fragile cage between me and that impossibly huge animal. Time stretched. I kept the engine running, the low vibration of the truck a small comfort. I dared not move my eyes away from it, not even to blink. And when I did, it was closer. I swear it wasn't walking in the normal sense. I couldn't hear footsteps, I couldn't hear the crunch of gravel under its weight, but somehow it moved closer in increments I couldn't measure. 3 steps, then 5, then suddenly, it was right beside the truck. My side mirror reflected its massive body, the fur coarse and dark, the sheer size of it bending reality. I could feel the air shift around it, the weight of it pressing like a physical force, not something that belonged to the natural world. I tried to reason with myself. Bears don't move like that. Bears don't appear out of the dark like nightmares. And yet, there it was, and I could feel the hair on my arms rise with each subtle movement it made. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, trying to summon any sense of control. The bear just stood there, almost as if it were studying me. Watching. Judging. It didn't threaten, it didn't lunge, but I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, a steady, loud reminder that I was utterly exposed. I tried to think of what to do. Reverse? Drive off? Startle it? Nothing felt safe. My brain screamed that the truck was the only thing between me and the immense, impossibly large animal. And then I realized that the static pressure I felt wasn't just in the air, it was in me. My body had locked up, muscles tense, every nerve screaming. It felt like the bear wasn't just standing next to the truck, it was inside me, filling my chest and my skull with its presence. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. I kept my headlights fixed on it. I didn't want to look away, because I knew if I did, I might not see it again until it was too late. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, telling myself it wasn't supernatural. It was a bear, a real bear, just enormous, and it wasn't moving to attack. But the fear was something else, primal, a deep-seated instinct that the brain can't override with logic. Then slowly I started the truck. I kept my movements careful, deliberate. My heart thudded in my chest like a drum. I shifted into drive, eyes never leaving the dark mass beside the truck. I moved forward, inch by inch, the gravel crunching under the tires. I felt its weight shift, like it was aware I was moving, but it didn't chase me. It didn't roar or make a sound. It just remained there, a mountain of fur and muscle, until I had driven far enough that it no longer filled my side mirror. Then finally it turned and melted back into the trees. Just disappeared. No sound, no trace, just the faint shimmer of dark fur against the darker woods. I kept driving for what felt like hours, my hands shaking on the wheel, eyes scanning the treeline for any sign of it. The highway stretched endlessly, nothing but gravel and darkness and the low hum of the truck. I forced myself to slow my breathing, to remind myself that I was alive, that I had survived this encounter. I realized that I had never been so scared in my life, not because the bear was attacking, but because it existed in a way that made the normal rules feel meaningless. It had been there, massive, real, and terrifying, and then it had simply let me go. When I finally reached a small pull-off a few miles later, I stopped the truck and shut the engine off. I sat in total silence, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from my body. My hands and legs were trembling, my stomach knotted. I thought about how I had been alone, completely unprotected, facing something that dwarfed me, and yet didn't need to. And I realized that I had underestimated the wilderness in a way that night would never let me forget. Eventually, I started driving again, slower this time, eyes never leaving the shadows near the treeline. I passed the spot where I had seen the bear, and it was just as empty as it had always been. But the memory of it, of the sheer presence, stayed with me. I told myself that I would never stop respecting the wildlife, never take the solitude of the Denali Highway for granted again. And I never did. That night had left its mark, a reminder that some things in the wild are not meant to be approached, not meant to be understood, and not meant to be challenged. By the time I reached the next town, the first signs of dawn were just beginning to brush the horizon. Pale, cold light spilled over the mountains, turning the sky from black to gray. The world seemed safe again, but I knew better. Somewhere out there, in the dark stretches of the Denali Highway, the bear still existed, still watched, still moved through the night like a force beyond comprehension. And I was lucky. I had survived, but only by inches. Even now, years later, whenever I drive alone in the dark, I remember the weight of it, the pressure it carried, the way it could exist without moving yet still make the world feel dangerous and alive. I never saw it again, but I know it's out there, somewhere, just beyond the reach of the headlights, standing and watching. And that memory, that knowledge, stays with me, a permanent scar from a night when the wild stared straight into my soul and let me live. That night on the Denali Highway, I learned a simple truth. Nature doesn't negotiate, it doesn't explain, and sometimes it doesn't even move. Sometimes it just watches, and if you're lucky, it lets you go. I was night fishing on the Fox River Flats near Soldotna in May 2014, and it was one of those nights that seemed quiet in a way that made the silence heavy. I had arrived just after midnight, parking my truck on the muddy shoulder of the road, where the flats began to stretch out wide and flat under the sky. The tide was high, and the river mouth shimmered under a full moon, turning the water a pale silver that reflected onto the mudflats like a sheet of glass. The air smelled cold and wet, carrying that raw scent of salt and river silt that always made my stomach tighten a little. I liked fishing at night. It was peaceful, and in those early hours it felt like the world had been reduced to just me, my gear, and the slow pulse of the water moving in and out. I set up my rod and bait, sitting on the edge of the flats where the water lapped gently at the muddy bank. The tide made a faint sucking sound with each pull back into the river, a steady rhythm that blended with the occasional call of a distant bird or the flapping of wings from some unseen bird moving through the darkness. I had been there for maybe an hour, listening to the water and watching the moonlight trace the curves of the river, when I first noticed it, the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was someone else fishing nearby, but the steps were slow and deliberate, steady like someone pacing. I froze, the line still in my hand, trying to pinpoint the sound. Step, pause, step. They were coming from behind me, over the mudflats. My truck was about 50 feet away, parked on higher ground, and the steps seemed to track closer and closer. When I turned, there was nothing. The mud behind me was undisturbed, and the night was still except for the faint rush of water. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox moving through the flats. But the sound didn't match anything I had ever heard in the flats before. It was heavier than a fox, slower than a raccoon, more deliberate. Step, pause, step. It matched the rhythm of someone walking in boots on wet sand. I tried to shake it off and focus on fishing, but my eyes kept darting over my shoulder. Every time I looked, nothing moved. The flats were empty, flat and open under the moon, except for the dark river curving into the distance. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The sound followed me. I got up to stretch, trying to calm my nerves, and the steps started again, exactly behind me. Every time I stopped, they stopped. Every time I moved, they matched my pace, never speeding up, never slowing down. My heart started pounding. I had walked these flats 100 times, but I had never felt watched like this. It wasn't just the sound of someone walking behind me. It was the weight of being followed, of someone keeping pace with me silently, invisibly. My stomach tightened. I had to get back to my truck, to the safety of metal and keys and lights. I started walking faster, keeping my eyes fixed on the glow of the truck's tail lights reflecting on the waterlogged road. Step, pause, step. They kept the pace. I broke into a jog. Step, pause, step. My boots splashed through shallow puddles in the mud, and I could hear my own breath grow sharp and loud in the cold night air. I sprinted. The sound followed. Every step I took, the steps followed, matching exactly like a mirror of my movement across the flats. I reached the edge of the flats where the ground rose to meet the road. My truck was just ahead. My hands fumbled with the keys as I reached the tailgate, my chest burning, sweat mixing with the cold air. I swung the door open and jumped onto the bed, panting hard. For a moment, nothing moved. No steps. No pause. Just silence. I waited, straining to hear anything at all. The river gurgled below, the moonlight spilling over the flats, the occasional flap of a bird. Nothing else. I climbed down into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there for a long while. My hands were shaking, my heart refusing to slow. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, the slow, deliberate steps in my head, following me across the flats. I didn't go back to the Fox River Flats alone after that night. For weeks, I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Footprints didn't make sense because I never saw any. Animals didn't make sense because nothing moves like that, in that slow, precise rhythm, and matches your pace perfectly. I even thought about leaving town for a while, just to shake the memory loose. Eventually, I realized something important about that night. Whatever, or whoever, was there didn't do anything beyond following me. There was no attack, no visible threat, no sound beyond the footsteps. And that was what made it worse. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a story to tell around a campfire. It was just someone, or something, able to track me perfectly unseen. The memory of being mirrored, watched, and unable to confront or escape whatever it was, stayed with me in a way I hadn't expected. When I finally returned to the flats, I went during the day with a friend. The mud was soft underfoot, water glinting under the sun. Nothing followed. The flats looked the same, quiet and open, but the silence no longer felt safe. I understood then that what I had experienced wasn't supernatural. It was real. It was the way some people, or animals, can move in silence, can track without being noticed, can exist in a place and time that seems empty. That night taught me caution, awareness, and the unnerving fact that sometimes the things that scare you aren't made of smoke or myth. They're made of ordinary things moving in ways you aren't expecting. Even now, years later, I remember the sound. Step, pause, step. The flats are just flats, the river just flows, and the moon just lights the night. But that sound, perfectly paced behind me, is something I'll never forget. It didn't have a face. It didn't speak. It didn't reach out. It didn't need to. All it did was follow, and that was enough. I never fish alone on the flats after dark. I make sure the truck is close. I make sure someone knows where I am. And I never, ever ignore the sound of footsteps in the quiet of a night that seems too still. The memory isn't some tale I tell for fun. It's a lesson. Silence is never truly empty, and movement can be watched without knowing it. The Fox River Flats didn't change. I did. I became someone who listens. Someone who moves carefully. Someone who knows that on those flats, under the moonlight, you are never truly alone, even if you think you are. By the time the tide ebbs and the water retreats back into the river, the flats are left smooth and silent, but I know better. Footsteps can appear anywhere. The river doesn't tell you who's there, and the night doesn't warn you when something follows. All I know is that I survived by keeping my head, by moving quickly, and by trusting the instinct that said, "Get out now." And sometimes that's all you need to do. Just leave the place, get back to safety, and carry the memory with you, sharper and heavier than any scar. I never went back alone at night again, and I never will. The flats are peaceful in daylight, but under the full moon, they are unpredictable and quiet in a way that keeps me honest. Step, pause, step. It's a rhythm that will follow me forever, a reminder that being careful matters, and that sometimes the most terrifying things are not ghosts or monsters. They are just real and unseen and very close. I remember that night on Lake Clark as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I had planned the trip for months, just me, my canoe, and the water. I had been looking forward to the solitude, the quiet, the way the lake felt almost alive when no one else was around. The air had been crisp that day, the kind of late summer warmth that feels heavy but not uncomfortable. I pushed off from the small, rocky shoreline in the early afternoon, the canoe gliding smoothly over the dark green water. The sun was still high when I started, but by the time I had paddled toward the center of the lake, the sky was soft, fading gold, and the distant mountains seemed to hold their breath. I was completely alone, or so I thought. Around 7:15 p.m., I noticed the fog rolling in. At first, it was just a thin mist curling off the surface of the water. I paddled a little further, enjoying the way the mist clung to the trees along the shore, but within minutes it thickened, swallowing the lake in a gray, cotton-like blanket. My visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and the distant mountains disappeared entirely. I slowed, listening to the faint sound of water against my canoe, my own paddling almost muted by the fog. Everything was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of birds or insects seemed dulled, trapped behind the heavy mist. Then I heard it, a rhythmic splash, steady, methodical, but not mine. At first, I thought it might be an echo from a distant part of the lake, maybe another canoe, but the timing was too precise. Each stroke was deliberate, measured. My stomach tightened. I called out, expecting maybe a reply, but no sound returned. Only the soft slap of water against my canoe answered me, and then almost immediately, I felt it, ripples spreading around my boat, subtle at first, brushing against the hull in patterns that were too deliberate to be random. I froze, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I scanned the fog, straining my eyes for even a glimpse of another paddle, another canoe, anything. There was nothing, just gray and mist and my own breathing, sharp in the cold air. But the water told a different story. The ripples didn't drift away, they circled my canoe, forming wakes that mirrored my own movements. It was as if someone or something was following me, keeping pace just beyond what I could see. Panic started to creep in, slow and heavy. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands trembled as I gripped the paddle. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a fisherman? Maybe another solo traveler? But the lake was massive, and there had been no signs of anyone else all day. And why hadn't I seen them before the fog? My mind was grasping for answers, but each explanation seemed weaker than the last. I tried to keep moving, paddling slowly at first, testing whether the ripples would continue. They did. Every movement I made was mirrored by the water, just beyond the fog. I couldn't see a shape, couldn't hear voices, nothing but the sound of water, my paddle, and that unnerving rhythm following me. The fog felt thicker now, heavier, like it was pressing against my skin, filling my ears, swallowing the world beyond a few feet. I started paddling faster, my strokes growing desperate. The wake stayed with me. It wasn't random, it followed my every move. If I paused, it slowed but never disappeared. If I turned, it turned too, keeping distance but never letting me get away. My arms ached, my chest burned from the effort, but the fear pushed me harder. I kept scanning the fog, my mind desperate to make sense of what I was experiencing, but I could see nothing. The only certainty was that someone or something was out there, and it was patient. I tried to control my breathing to stay calm, telling myself I was overreacting. But the water didn't lie. I could feel it more than see it, an awareness, a presence that I could not shake. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I imagined shapes in the fog, the outline of a canoe, a paddle slicing through the water. But when I blinked, they vanished. The lake had become a void, a gray tunnel, and I was trapped inside it. I decided I couldn't stay. The shore had to be my goal. I remembered the map and the landmarks I had noted earlier, but the fog had erased them. I paddled hard, judging distance by the faint sound of water against rocks I had memorized. The ripples stayed close, like an invisible escort, never letting me slow down. Each stroke felt heavier, my muscles screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. The thought of sitting still, of letting whatever it was come closer, was unbearable. Time stretched on. Minutes became hours, though I knew it couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 minutes. My arms were shaking, my back aching, and the cold was starting to seep through my jacket. Sweat and fog mixed on my face, stinging my eyes. Still, I kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and stubborn determination. I focused on the sound of the shore, on the small differences in the rhythm of the water near land. My mental map guided me through the gray, each paddle stroke a prayer that I was moving in the right direction. Finally, I saw it, the outline of the trees, dark shapes cutting through the gray. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with paranoia. I paddled harder, forcing the canoe to move faster, ignoring the burning in my arms. As I drew closer, I realized the ripples behind me had not followed the same urgency. They lingered for a moment, hesitant, and then faded back into the gray. I reached the shore in a sweat-soaked, trembling mess. My hands were raw, my heart pounding, and I couldn't stop shaking. I pulled the canoe onto the rocks and collapsed beside it, gasping for air. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the lake, expecting the same rhythm to start again. It didn't. The fog was thinning now, retreating as the night grew darker, leaving me alone once more. When I finally stood and looked back at the water, the lake appeared normal again. No ripples, no wakes, nothing out of place. Just the quiet, dark water reflecting the dim light of the evening. I realized that what had followed me had never revealed itself, never needed to. Its presence had been in the water, in the rhythm, in the way the fog seemed to move around me. It was a silent observer, a patient watcher, and I had been the only one who knew it was there. I never went back to Lake Clark at night after that. I told myself it was a lesson in caution, in respecting the solitude of the wilderness, but deep down, I knew it was more. That night left a mark on me, an awareness that some things on the water are better left unseen. I never paddled alone after dark again. I carry that memory every time I'm on a lake, always scanning the mist, always listening for the rhythm that might be following just beyond sight. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a story to tell children. It was real, simple, and terrifying, the raw uncertainty of being on a vast lake, completely alone, with someone else out there, just beyond the fog, moving silently, matching my every move. And that knowledge, that certainty that I had been watched and could have been intercepted at any moment, is something I will never forget. It changed the way I moved through quiet water forever. I spent the winter of 2019 alone in a hunting cabin up near Windy Pass, north of Nome. The place was remote, far from any road or settlement, surrounded by frozen tundra and jagged hills. The cabin itself was small and sturdy, built from logs with a metal roof, and it had seen its fair share of harsh winters. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke, old insulation, and the faint tang of metal from the hunting tools I kept around. I was there to track and hunt, to test my ability to survive alone in the kind of cold and isolation most people only read about. The days were short, and the nights were long and dark, especially in October when the sun barely rose above the horizon. I had settled into a routine. Each morning I would wake early, check my traps, and scan the hills for any signs of wildlife. I kept a fire going almost constantly, rotating between wood and the small stash of fuel oil I had brought with me. My nights were quiet, almost unbearably so. I had no neighbors, no cell service, and no one for miles except for the occasional bird or fox. That was exactly how I wanted it. Peaceful, uninterrupted solitude. The night it happened, I had gone to bed around 10 p.m., exhausted after a long day of tracking caribou. The wind was high that evening, rattling the loose shutters and whistling through the corners of the cabin. I had double-checked all the doors before bed and made sure my rifle was within arm's reach, leaning against the wall near the bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke briefly to the sound of the wind pounding against the cabin. It was nothing unusual, so I drifted back to sleep. At exactly 4:47 a.m., I woke again, but this time it wasn't the wind. I froze in bed because I could hear the faint, deliberate sound of the cabin door handle turning. Slowly. Careful. Methodical. Someone, or something, was trying to open my door. My heart started to race, and my hands went straight to the rifle. The cabin was pitch dark, and every nerve in my body screamed that something was wrong. I could hear the slight creak of the hinges as the knob twisted, again and again. I locked the door, sliding the bolt across as quietly as I could. The handle kept turning for another few seconds, then stopped. I leaned back against the wall, listening. That's when I heard it, a slow, heavy scraping sound coming from above me. On the metal roof. Someone was crawling across it. Each movement sounded deliberate and weighed down, like a person with heavy boots was testing the structure of the roof. I pressed my back harder against the wall, straining to see through the small, frosted window in the door, but it was impossible. I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Hey! Nothing. No response, not even a shift in the noise. I stayed where I was, gripping the rifle, waiting. The scraping continued for several minutes, moving slowly from one end of the roof to the other. Then it stopped abruptly. Silence. The kind of silence that pressed in on your ears and made your chest tight. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner, the rifle across my lap, listening to the wind, waiting for something, anything to happen. I didn't hear more footsteps on the roof that night, but I did hear small, faint noises outside, snaps, crunches in the snow that weren't there before. I didn't open the door until first light. When I finally did, I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the crisp snow. I scanned the area with my eyes, looking for footprints, broken branches, or any sign of someone having been there. The snow around the cabin was untouched except for my own deep tracks from when I had arrived. No footprints led away from the cabin, no scuffed patches in the snow, nothing. The roof was undisturbed, the trees standing straight and still. It was like the person who had been there had never existed. I circled the cabin, checking every angle, every corner. I checked the windows, the chimney, the back door. Everything was intact. There was no evidence that anyone had climbed on the roof. No footprints, no marks, nothing. The more I looked, the more impossible it seemed. Yet, I had heard it. I had felt it. I had been awake, alert, and there was no mistaking the sounds I had heard in the darkness. The sun started to rise, spilling pale orange light over the hills. The wind had died down somewhat, and the forest around me looked calm and still. I stayed outside for an hour, walking the perimeter of the cabin, checking the surrounding trees and snowdrifts. Still nothing. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? No, I was too alert, too awake. Every detail was burned into my memory. The feel of the rifle in my hands, the sound of the handle turning, the scraping of the roof. It wasn't a dream. It had happened. By mid-morning, I returned inside and sat at the small wooden table with my coffee, trying to calm myself. I kept scanning the windows, straining to see any movement outside. Nothing. The snow reflected the morning light so brightly that it almost hurt to look, but still, no sign of anything unusual. I checked the locks again, just to be sure, and then did something I hadn't done before. I went through my emergency gear. I checked my food, my survival tools, and my communications equipment. Everything was in order, but my sense of security was gone. The next days were tense. Every time the wind rattled the cabin, I froze, listening for any noise on the roof or outside. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone again, and no one came to the cabin. Yet the memory of that early morning never left me. It made me meticulous about checking the cabin, about making sure all doors were locked, about sitting quietly in the corner with the rifle in my lap until daylight. I stopped leaving the cabin at night altogether. Weeks later, when I finally left the cabin to return to town, I looked back at it one last time. From the ridge above, it looked peaceful and quiet, like it always had. There were no signs of anyone having been there. And yet, I knew what had happened. I didn't try to rationalize it. There was no ghost, no fairy tale explanation. It wasn't supernatural. It was simply someone, maybe a trespasser, or maybe a desperate hunter, trying to get in, moving carefully and quietly. They had never been caught, never left a trace in the snow. The wilderness can hide people just as well as it hides animals. I don't know who it was, or why they were on my roof that night. I don't think I ever will. But I know I survived because I was cautious, because I stayed alert, and because I never assumed I was alone. That cabin in that remote pass taught me a lesson about respect for the land, and for the fact that sometimes danger isn't obvious. It hides in silence, in footprints that vanish, in moments so fleeting you question whether they even happened. Even now, thinking back, I can still hear the slow, deliberate turning of that door handle, the scrape of boots on metal above me. It stays with me, not as a ghost story, but as a memory of raw reality. People can be unpredictable, and the wilderness can amplify that unpredictability until it becomes something you can feel in your bones. That October in 2019, I learned that the most important skill in the wilderness isn't hunting or building fires. It's paying attention, trusting your instincts, and being ready for what you can't see. I left the cabin behind, but I don't forget it. The memory is clear and sharp, like the icy air that morning. And I know that out there, in places like Windy Pass, you're never truly alone. You just hope the silence around you stays exactly that, silent. I remember the night clearly, even though it was almost 16 years ago. I was on a geology survey in the Western Brooks Range, near Anaktuvuk Pass, in March of 2007. The winter was harsh, colder than I had expected even for Alaska, and the landscape stretched endlessly, a frozen sea of jagged ridges, snowfields, and dark, rocky outcrops. The sun had disappeared weeks earlier, leaving long, shadowed nights that swallowed sound and light alike. I was alone for most of my survey, trudging through snowdrifts that sometimes reached above my knees, mapping rock formations and sampling soil and rock for later analysis. My work was routine, methodical, and safe, or so I thought. That night, I had set up camp on a small ridge overlooking a wide valley. The sky was clear, colder than I even knew was possible. The stars were sharp, icy points, piercing the darkness, and the aurora borealis shimmered faintly in the distance, a green and purple haze on the horizon. I had just finished taking notes in my journal, marking the coordinates of the formations I had been surveying that day, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection on the snow, or maybe the northern lights playing games with my tired eyes. But then the shapes moved again, deliberately, with a rhythm that no natural phenomenon I knew could produce. I turned fully to face it and froze. There were lights over the valley, low in the sky, far lower than any aircraft should fly. They moved in grid patterns, precise and mechanical, almost as if someone had drawn them into the night with a ruler. They hovered, blinked, and shifted in ways that didn't make sense. One would rise, another would fall. They would line up in straight lines and then scatter in arcs that defied normal movement. I had been around aircraft plenty of times, small bush planes, helicopters, drones, but nothing I had ever seen moved like this. And the intensity of the light was different, too clean, cold, almost metallic, cutting through the darkness with an unnatural clarity. I tried to focus on them, to track their paths, to make sense of what I was seeing, but my eyes kept jumping. My pulse raced. I felt exposed, tiny against the vast expanse of snow and rock, the night pressing in around me. I thought maybe they were some kind of research drones, military tests, or some experimental aircraft. But the patterns, they weren't random enough for a test. They were organized, almost intelligent in how they moved. And then just as suddenly as they appeared, they blinked out. It was like someone had switched off a dozen lights at once. The valley went dark again, the stars above clear and indifferent. I exhaled sharply, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was probably nothing. Snow reflecting moonlight, electrical equipment in the distance, something explainable. I took a few steps closer to the ridge edge, peering into the valley, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. That's when the sound began. It started faintly, a low hum, almost like distant wind, but deeper. Then it grew, a vibrating, pulsing tone that filled the valley and pressed against my chest. It sounded like thousands of insects buzzing, but much larger, heavier, resonating through the ice, through the rocks, through me. I could feel it in my bones. Every step I took, every breath I drew seemed to amplify it. My teeth rattled from the vibration. I crouched, gripping the snow for balance, and tried to locate the source. It wasn't above me, it wasn't below me, it was all around. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange frequency. Panic was rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. I have always tried to think scientifically, rationally. I checked my radio, no signal. My GPS was working, but the readings were normal, no interference. I looked again at the sky, at the empty valley, half expecting the lights to return. They didn't. I stayed there, frozen, listening to the sound that had no visible source. It persisted for several minutes, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I stood there for a long time, shivering, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. The night was silent now, save for the occasional gust of wind over the ridge. My instincts told me to pack up and leave immediately, to drive my snowmobile back to the nearest outpost, but the snow and terrain made travel difficult. Besides, I was alone. No one would believe me if I just drove off. My rational side fought with my fear. I told myself to document everything. So I did. I wrote down the time, the coordinates, the patterns I had seen, every detail of the sound, every sensation I had felt in my chest and bones. Sleep was impossible. I tried to huddle in my tent, but the memory of the lights and the vibration haunted me. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind sounded like a distant echo of that buzzing. I tried to reason. Maybe it was a rare atmospheric phenomenon, something to do with ionization in the upper atmosphere. Maybe it was aurora-related electromagnetic activity interacting with the terrain. I wasn't a physicist, but I knew the Brooks Range could produce strange effects. Still, my mind rejected these explanations. I had seen enough flights of drones, weather balloons, aircraft tests, and nothing behaved like those lights. By morning, the sky had cleared. The valley was bright and white with fresh snow. The world looked normal again. I surveyed the area I had been working in, trying to find anything, tracks, evidence, something to explain the event. Nothing. There was no evidence of aircraft, no melted snow, no mechanical residue. It was as if the lights and the sound had been ghosts in the night, but I refused to think in supernatural terms. Over the next few days, I continued my survey, documenting rock samples and formations, but I remained hyper-aware. Every shadow, every movement of the wind, every reflection of light off ice made me pause. I kept hoping for a rational explanation to present itself, some mechanical or natural cause I had overlooked. But I found none. The experience left a weight in my chest, a tension in my mind. Eventually, I returned to my home base and reported my observations to the agency overseeing the survey. They were polite but skeptical. Some suggested aurora interference, drones, or even hallucinations caused by isolation and cold. I knew what I had seen and heard, and I knew I hadn't imagined it. I had worked in the Arctic for years. I had been alone for days in freezing temperatures before. I had never hallucinated like that. Months later, I reviewed satellite imagery from the night in question. I looked for aircraft flight paths, any unusual thermal signatures, or anything that might explain the phenomenon. There were no flight paths low over the valley, no recorded tests, no thermal anomalies. The lights and the sound remained unaccounted for. Even now, I think back on that night. The memory is vivid, more real than any dream. I feel the cold wind, the vibration in my bones, the sharp, precise movement of the lights. I don't know what it was, and I may never know. But I also know that I was lucky. I was in a remote, unforgiving landscape where a simple misstep could have ended badly. The experience taught me caution, respect for the unknown forces that can exist in the world, and the limits of what we can explain. I still go back to the Brooks Range sometimes, continuing my work, but I always remember that night. I keep my eyes on the sky in a way I never did before, listening carefully for sounds that seem out of place. I have accepted that some phenomena may not have immediate explanations, but I have also learned to prepare, to respect my environment, and to document everything meticulously. That night was terrifying, yes, but it also reminded me why I love exploring, studying, and understanding the natural world. The unknown doesn't always mean danger, but it always demands attention. And in that clarity, I found a sort of resolution. I may not know exactly what I saw or heard, but I know I experienced it fully, honestly, and without embellishment. The lights over the western Brooks Range were real. The buzzing vibration was real. I survived it, and in doing so, I grew more aware, more precise, and more deeply connected to the remote, wild world I study. That night no longer haunts me, it guides me. It reminds me to be careful, to be present, and to keep my mind open to what the world might show me, even when it makes no sense. The memory is clear, the details unshakable, and I am certain of one thing. The world is bigger, stranger, and more precise than I ever realized. And that knowledge, terrifying though it was, gave me a sense of control, of readiness, that nothing else could. I never found an explanation, but I found understanding. Some mysteries exist simply to be observed, not solved. And sometimes that is enough. I remember that night near Ninilchik in late September, as if it had burned itself into my memory. I had been out trapping alone for days, following the small game trails through the brush, checking my snares and resetting traps. The air was crisp, carrying that early fall bite that makes your lungs feel sharp when you breathe. The leaves were turning, reds and golds, and the ground was soft with fallen needles. Normally, by this time of evening, the forest would be alive with sound, the call of birds settling in for the night, the rustle of small mammals, and if you were lucky or unlucky, wolves howling as darkness fell. Wolves had always been a part of this place, a distant, echoing presence that reminded you that you weren't alone. But that night there was nothing. Dead silence. I had walked most of the day, my boots squishing in the damp undergrowth, checking each trap in turn. The sun was already low, painting long shadows through the alder brush. I had finished the last trap, a small snare near a creek that cut through the forest, when I realized I was running late. I packed up my gear, slinging the traps over my shoulder, and started back toward my cabin. The forest around me was quiet. So quiet it was unnerving. There should have been some sound of life, any life, but there was nothing. No birds, no rustling of rodents, no distant growl or yelp. Just the wind moving lightly through the leaves, if you could call it that. It was almost too still. I told myself it was just the way the forest was that night, that maybe the animals had gone deeper into cover as the sun went down. I tried to focus on the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves, on the small noises I could make, so I wouldn't hear the silence as something alive. Then I heard it, a sound unlike any other. Not growling, not a snap of a twig under a foot, but a heavy, slow, deep breathing. I froze immediately. My pulse jumped. The sound wasn't far. It was just beyond the alder brush to my left, moving slightly, as if whatever was making it was pacing. I held my breath, straining to hear over my own heart. The breathing was steady, deliberate, close enough that I could feel the vibrations through the soil beneath my boots. I could not see anything. I clicked on my headlamp, swinging the beam slowly over the brush, the fallen logs, the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. I blinked, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't ordinary wolf tracks. They were enormous, much larger than anything I had ever seen. Each print was perfectly round at the pads, and there were no claw marks. Wolves always leave claw marks. Always. These tracks were fresh, leading straight toward me from the alder brush, as though whatever had made them had been standing there the entire time I was frozen in place. I bent down, squinting to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Mud clung to the edges of the tracks, pressed deep, indicating something heavy, far heavier than a wolf, had pressed down on the earth. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. My boots slipped in the soft dirt as I ran blindly through the brush, over fallen branches, scrambling down the small incline toward the creek. My headlamp bounced over the trees, the light catching every branch and leaf like a strobe, but I didn't stop to look back. I could hear it then, not just the breathing now but the faintest crunch of weight behind me. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. Every step I took, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I stumbled into the creek bed, water splashing over my boots, and for a moment I thought I'd lost it. I slowed, trying to catch my breath, peering through the dim light, but there was nothing. The tracks had disappeared. For a second, relief washed over me. I was alone. But then I noticed something else. The snow from last week had melted in patches, leaving soft, dark mud along the creek. And there they were again, footprints leading along the bank, massive and deep, following the same path I had taken, as if it had been waiting for me. I stayed low, moving carefully now, keeping the creek between me and the direction the tracks came from. I realized the forest had gone completely silent again. The wind had dropped entirely. Even the creek sounded muted, the water gurgling over rocks in a whisper. I felt exposed, standing there in the dark with the weight of something unseen pressing in from the shadows. My mind raced through possibilities, some wild bear maybe, though the tracks didn't match, or a large moose, but the shape wasn't right, the pads were wrong. Whatever it wasn't normal. I kept moving, slower now, deliberately, using every ounce of my knowledge of the land. I stuck to areas where I had high ground, where I could see any movement, and avoided open patches. My headlamp flickered as I walked, once, twice, and I smacked it against my helmet to keep it steady. That's when I saw another clue. Broken branches. Small ones, snapped at waist height, as if something huge had brushed through them. It wasn't fast, it wasn't chasing, but it was following carefully, silently. Hours seemed to pass. I knew I had to make it back to my cabin before the night fully swallowed the forest. I took my time, choosing the safest path rather than the fastest, circling back toward familiar landmarks. Every time I thought I had lost it, every time the forest returned to quiet, I would hear that breathing again, slow and steady, somewhere just out of sight. Finally, I reached a ridge I knew, a slope that would lead me down into the small clearing where my cabin stood. I paused at the top, scanning the darkened trees with my light. Nothing. The ridge was clear. I started down, boots digging into the loose soil, and then I saw them one last time, prints in the soft mud at the edge of the clearing. The biggest ones yet, leading directly to my cabin. And then they stopped. I don't know why. Maybe whatever had been following me didn't want to cross into the open. maybe it was satisfied with having scared me. I didn't wait to find out. I ran the last few hundred yards, nearly tripping over roots and rocks, and slammed the door behind me, locking it. I checked every window, every corner, listening for the sound of that breathing, but there was nothing. Silence again, total and complete. I stayed awake all night, headlamp beside me, knife in hand, listening for any hint of movement outside. None came. By morning, the tracks were gone. I went outside cautiously, scanning the mud and forest edge. There was no trace of anything, not even broken branches or disturbed leaves. It was as if nothing had been there at all. But I knew better. I had seen the prints, heard the breathing, felt the weight of something massive moving just out of reach. I packed up my traps and left that area for good, heading farther inland, to places where I could at least hear wolves howling, where the forest felt alive. Even now, months later, I can remember that night with perfect clarity. The smell of damp leaves, the cold bite in the air, the crunch of mud under my boots. And I can still hear it sometimes, in my memory, the slow, deep breathing of something that wasn't a wolf, following, waiting, patient. Whatever it was real. It existed. And I know if I had stayed out there just a few minutes longer, I wouldn't have made it back. That night taught me something I had never fully believed before. The wilderness holds things you cannot explain, things that move quietly, patiently, and they notice you far before you notice them. I never went back to that stretch of forest. I took a different route the next fall, further from the coast, where the tracks couldn't follow, where the trees didn't press so closely together. I still trap, still walk the wilds, but I carry that memory with me like a warning. I know now to respect the silence, to notice what isn't there, and to trust the instinct that tells you when to run. And I do. Every time. That's how I survived. Not by fighting, not by confronting whatever it was, but by recognizing the danger and getting out while I could. The tracks, the breathing, the silence, they were a signal. The forest is bigger than us, and some of what lives in it doesn't need claws or fangs to be deadly. It just needs patience. And that night, I was lucky enough to outrun it. I remember that day in July 2015 like it's etched into my mind in high definition, every detail sharp and vivid. I had decided to go for a solo hike near Hatcher Pass, just me, my boots, my backpack with water and some snacks, and the wilderness stretching for miles. The sun was low, around 6 in the evening, casting long shadows through the spruce and birch. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, warm from the day but carrying a crisp hint of the coming night. Birds were still calling, their songs echoing off the slopes, but everything felt quieter than it should have. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I was following a trail that wound through a small valley. The path was narrow, with roots twisting across it like veins, and rocks that threatened to catch my boots with every step. I loved hikes like this because they made me feel small and alive at the same time. I had my headphones tucked into my pocket, but I wasn't using them. I liked the sounds of the woods, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the snap of a branch in the distance. The sun was low enough to create patches of golden light that danced across the underbrush. After about an hour, I rounded a bend that opened into a small clearing. And then I saw him. At first, I thought he was just a hunter, someone out in the woods like me, maybe finishing up a day of tracking. He was wearing old hunting gear, camo that looked straight out of the 1970s. The jacket was faded, patched in places, and the pants were thick and worn. But there was something about him that didn't make sense. He wasn't carrying a pack or a rifle. Nothing. He was just standing there, perfectly still, like a figure someone had planted in the clearing. I called out a casual hello, meant to break the silence. He didn't blink. He didn't move a muscle, not even the slightest twitch. I frowned and took a step forward. My boots crunched on the dry leaves and pine needles. My stomach twisted. I called again, a bit louder, but still nothing. His face was blank, completely still, like a mask. And then his head moved. Slowly. Unnaturally. It tilted. To the side. Not the way a person tilts their head when curious. Not the way anyone tilts their head normally. It was like his skull didn't work the way it was supposed to. And his eyes, when they finally met mine, were the worst part. They were completely black. Not brown or blue, but voids, like someone had emptied them of everything. No whites, no iris, nothing. Just darkness. I froze. My heart was hammering so hard I thought he could hear it. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I tried to look away, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow, maybe he had some kind of face paint, maybe he wasn't even human. But my mind kept going back to those eyes. The darkness in them wasn't empty, it was intentional. Like it was aware. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on him, and then my foot caught a root. I fell forward hard, scraping my hands on the dirt and moss. Pain shot up my arm, but I barely noticed it. When I looked back, he was gone. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Nothing. The only evidence that he had ever existed was the imprint of terror in my chest. I scrambled to my feet and started moving down the trail faster, my mind racing. Every sound made me flinch, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even the wind brushing through the trees. I didn't dare look behind me, but I kept imagining him reappearing, tilting his head in that impossible way, those black voids staring through me. As I moved, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had been hallucinating. Maybe it was exhaustion, dehydration, or the long hours in the sun. But I had been careful. I had water. I had eaten. I was not that tired. And yet, something about him wasn't just a trick of my mind. It was too precise, too deliberate. I could still feel the weight of his gaze on me, lingering even though he wasn't there. I reached a point where the trail split, a fork I hadn't noticed before. My instincts told me to take the path that led downhill, away from the clearing, and I did. Branches scraped my shoulders, and the ground grew uneven, muddy in places where the snow from last week had melted. Every step I took was careful, deliberate. My hands gripped the straps of my backpack, as if holding on would make me safer. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 minutes, I emerged onto a wider trail where other hikers were passing. The sudden normalcy was almost jarring. Families with dogs, joggers in bright clothes, the smell of someone's campfire in the distance. It all made my heart rate slowly return to normal. But even among people, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept scanning the trees on either side, expecting him to step out from behind a trunk, tilt his head, and stare at me again. I finally reached my car parked near the trailhead. The engine hummed to life, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror as I drove away. Nothing. Just trees and fading sunlight. I told myself it was over, that the woods hadn't given up their secret. But even now, when I think back to that day, I can feel it. That impossible stillness. The unnatural tilt of his head. The black eyes. I know I saw it. I know it was real. Weeks later, I returned to the trail with a friend, hoping to rationalize it. Maybe there had been someone in old hunting clothes hiding, or just wandering aimlessly. But when we reached the clearing, there was nothing. No sign of anyone ever being there. No footprints, no trampled leaves, nothing. Just the same untouched forest floor, silent and patient. My friend didn't see anything unusual. He thought I was exaggerating, imagining things. I couldn't convince him. I couldn't convince anyone. I never went back alone. I stick to the well-traveled trails now. I've read stories about people seeing strange figures in the woods, but this wasn't a story. It wasn't folklore. It was a person, or something that looked like a person, but there was nothing human about it. And I realized something about that evening that chills me more than the memory itself. It wasn't a place you can run from. You can leave, but it follows you. In the way you replay it in your mind. In the way you check the trees at dusk. In the way you think about the paths you walk alone. I still hike, but I'm different now. Always alert, always aware of every shadow, every movement, every sound. I carry a flashlight, even when the sun is high, and I never go out after 5 in the evening. I've told a few close friends what happened, but I don't say it aloud to strangers because it's the kind of thing that can't be proven. People ask if I think it was a wild person, a hunter, or someone playing a prank. I tell them I don't know, and I don't. But I do know that whatever it was patient, and it was waiting for me to notice it. That day changed the way I see the woods. What used to feel peaceful now feels like a place with a quiet, careful watchfulness. You never walk alone in the forest without feeling eyes on you, even when no one is there. And the memory of those black eyes, that unnatural stillness, stays with me. I think about it every time I hear a rustle behind me, or when I round a bend in a forest trail. It's a reminder that the world can be ordinary and terrifying at the same time, and that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that don't move, don't speak, and don't blink. I haven't seen him again. I hope I never will. But I know that in some corner of Hatcher Pass, in a clearing just like that one, he is still standing, still waiting, and still watching. And knowing that makes every hike, every forest, every quiet moment outside feel like a gamble. The forest hasn't forgotten me, and I know it never will. The memory of that evening, that impossible figure, has stayed with me as a warning and a mark. I walk differently now, I listen differently, and I look differently. And in my mind, sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can hear the faint whisper of movement in the trees, and I remember that he doesn't need to move to make you notice him. He's still out there, and I know it.